So take a minute to look at this photo. This isn't just any skyline. This is Makati in Manila. So Manila is the capital of the Philippines. About 24 million people live in the metropolis. And the buildings you see in this picture, these house thousands and thousands of offshore workers that conduct various functions for Western firms. And I spent a good chunk of my career in the buildings that you see in this picture putting together teams to do functions for a large multinational firm. Now, that practice is referred to as offshoring. It's been around since the dot-com era. So it initially started with what we call John in Mumbai. So that was an old joke that goes back to the Hewlett Packard days. I remember seeing a Dilbert comic on a cubicle, and there was a gentleman there answering the phone, and he said his name was Abhishek, and they said, no, your name's John, and everybody had a good laugh. And the idea was that the customer service functions that went to India, people weren't necessarily comfortable with that, so they had these individuals use Western names, and it wasn't fooling anybody. Well, what ended up happening with customer service offshoring to Mumbai is that it then moved to Manila, and what you would find in Manila were a huge population of people that spoke very good English, that had a great deal of empathy in speaking with other people, more emotional intelligence. It's just cultural. And they were just better served for customer service, and they were cheaper. So I recall a time when we were looking at hiring 3 analysts in Manila for 1 person in Mumbai. And that was prior to when we could get 5 for 1. So they're definitely cheaper in Manila, but that comes with its own challenges. Now, what then happened was Mumbai moved to more back and middle office functions, and Manila kept the customer service bits. So offshoring's been around for a while. It's nothing new. But what most companies don't realize is just how challenging it is. And I've pulled a couple charts here to make some points about the challenges. And they say poor communication. Well, that isn't just about being able to write emails. That's also about whether or not you can communicate because electricity is down or the internet's down or any number of reasons. There's quality control problems because now you're working in a completely different environment that you can't control. There's cultural differences. You're not guaranteed to save money. So just because you got 5 heads for one doesn't mean that the functions run across the same way. So there are a great deal of problems that you run into with offshoring, and we had a very challenging time, particularly in the Philippines, though we made it work, in trying to build a team there that could do what the team in Hong Kong that was being replaced could do. Now, another huge problem you run into when you're doing offshoring is the cost. Now, I can recall before this chart, so that would have been 2016, 2017, sitting down on comp day, and what they'll do when they're looking at raises across the board, they'll take into account inflation. And the reason why they do that is so they can stay competitive. I recall 2 years in a row with inflation for Mumbai was the highest of all our regions. Inflation was at 9%. And then you can see here this chart continues, 10%, 9.9, 7.5. What that means is if you hired a Mumbai analyst for 40K in 2017, you'd be paying them 62K in 2022. So wage inflation in India is very strong. In the Philippines, it's also starting to become an issue as well, though in the Philippines, I think there are many other issues that are concerning. For example, typhoons. Typhoon season's a major problem because you have flooding in Manila and your employees can't come into work. Even when there isn't flooding, the traffic is a nightmare. It's not uncommon for somebody to show up an hour or 2 hours late. Labor shortages. It's extremely competitive over there. Trying to hire talent is very, very difficult. Trying to hire great talent is even more difficult. Attrition. The great talent is in high demand, so they will move often for higher salaries. You have family emergencies. You have Filipinas versus Filipinos. And I know that some people might find this offensive, and I don't really care because if you worked in that environment, you would understand exactly what I'm saying. The Filipinas generally more competent than the Filipinos. That's the reality. Labor laws. You hire somebody that's incompetent, you're going to have a nightmare trying to get rid of them because the labor laws are very supportive of employees. So I recall trying to get rid of a bad apple and spending 30% of my time on documentation. So this is an extremely challenging environment to operate. So when we see a firm like TaskUs that operates with 27,000 employees in the Philippines, we did a double take. That's pretty remarkable. That's very difficult to ramp up that quickly. And TaskUs is a firm that was raised to us by one of our subscribers, and it was interesting on the tin. So they're doing some work that relates to AI. They're doing this digital CX work, which is a fancy term for customer service across various channels other than voice. And a great deal of their employees reside in the Philippines and another chunk there in India, and then some in the US. So we took a look under the hood because this firm is showing some very strong revenue growth, and on the tin, it looks very promising. Now, what do? Well, they do three different things. The majority of their work is around what I said, digital customer experience, or CX. This describes offering customer service through multiple digital channels. Then about a fifth of the work they're doing involves content security. That's going through, if you can imagine the people that sit there and scrutinize what you post on Facebook to say whether or not it's offensive. And we've dealt with these idiots before, and they're extremely arbitrary in terms of what they decide is offensive. And working with Facebook is an absolute nightmare, and their customer service is an absolute joke. So Facebook happens to be the biggest customer of TaskUs at 27% of 2021 revenues, and a great deal, though they don't break that down as to how much Facebook is in each of these categories. We would assume that content security is a big reason why Facebook is there, just based on the research we did for this video. And the research piece that we published relating to this video, I'll put in the description as well. And then the third function they do, AI services. This is similar to what a firm called Appen does. They're an Australian firm that we sold their stock a while ago because the work that they're doing, training AI algorithms, is only going to last so long before the AI algorithms are trained and able to do the work themselves. So we didn't see how they would be able to grow their business outside of that work. And since then, the company has run into some troubles, and I think they were recently going to be acquired, but they weren't. That's a whole different story. But data labeling isn't that sustainable because once AI algorithms become smart enough, there isn't a need for that. So we have these three functions. That's what TaskUs does. As we said earlier, almost 70% of the people working on these tasks are in the Philippines. Now, when you look at the business structure, they try to sell themselves as a software as a service firm, but they're not. They're a cheap labor as a service firm. So they will put up some metrics like 141% net retention. That's a typical SaaS metric. And that's great and all, but then you read this little paragraph here in the upper right. Our clients' ability to terminate engagements with or without cause, including for convenience, or opt for month-to-month contracts. So they don't have any sort of fixed contracts that can't be immediately terminated if the client chooses to. And then they say this about the client's inability or unwillingness to pay for services we have performed. That's an odd remark to make, especially when this company has $163 million in accounts receivable. That's very odd for so much money to be owed. And in their filings, we noted where they said some of their clients had gone bankrupt because of COVID and that they were trying to pursue money that they were owed. So that's all rather odd. And when you see the metrics they put up here about new client wins and their clients generating 500K, plus a year in revenue, and they try to spin themselves off as a SaaS company, they're not, because they need to scale bodies as fast as they scale revenue. For example, between 2021 and 2020, they grew revenue by almost 60%. Well, over 70% growth in headcount also accompanied that revenue growth. So that will eventually reach a limit, especially when you're trying to recruit in a challenging environment like the Philippines. Now, what TaskUs says they do different, they refer to themselves as a next generation BPO offering. That stands for business process outsourcing. It's a typical acronym used to describe these activities. So they have these tools. They've got a chat bot here. They've got some content security tool that highlights key terms that may be offensive to people. And then there's this cross-platform, they say RPA, it stands for Robotic Process Automation, enabled productivity alert system that supports work from home managers. Now, 90% of their employees are still working from home. That's great, but working from home in the Philippines is very difficult. We have employees now working for us here at Nanalyze that have challenges. They can be bandwidth challenges. There's typhoons, there's electricity outages, there's internet outages. There's a lot of problems with people working from home, more so even than people coming into the office. That we didn't see mentioned really as a risk, but it's a big risk when you're working with such a large workforce in the Philippines. Now, some other concerns we have around the sort of work they do, digital CX. So they may bring in a firm like UiPath to start automating some tasks, but customer service functions will usually require a human at the other end. So their ability to scale this particular function comes down to their ability to hire talent, and that's very difficult to do when you're trying to build out that quickly. Content security. Looking at the growth for that segment in 2021, it was largely confined to existing customers. And we can imagine, as we said, Facebook is responsible for a good chunk of that. Eventually, AI algorithms are going to be able to do this stuff. It just makes sense that that will happen. And if Facebook has a brain, they'll be taking the data that they're getting from these manual functions and training AI algorithms with that, and then not paying TaskUs anymore and saying, see ya, we'll do it in-house. So that's definitely a concern. And then, as we said, the AI operations, if you're helping AI algos learn, they'll eventually become smart enough to learn themselves. So generally speaking, the functions that TaskUs does, we don't think have that much potential. Now, some other concerns that you might note about the firm: Facebook at 27% of revenues we mentioned, and DoorDash at another 11% means that 38% of revenues for TaskUs come from two customers. That's customer concentration risk. Now, there's a short report. If you're somebody who's invested in TaskUs or thinking about investing in them, we're not. You can take a look at this short report. We didn't even crack it open until we had finished our research. And indeed, the short report mentions some of the concerns that we have, and it mentions a whole lot more. It's 80 pages. We didn't have the time nor desire to read it because it's pointless. We've already decided this is not a firm we would invest in. So you may want to take a look at that if you so desire. They also mentioned a couple other BPO stocks that they actually went long. So what they did is they shorted TaskUs and went long two of their competitors. Quite an interesting play to make there. So you can read about that in the short report. And then, a big concern here is that once rising wages erode the cost advantage in the Philippines or in Mumbai or in Vietnam or whatever country that they're going to move to next to try to take advantage of cheap labor, then what, right? So when that cost advantage leaves, you either have to pass that on to the customer, the end customer, and good luck trying to convince Facebook to take on those added costs. You have to pass that on, or your margins decrease over time. So it's hard to see how this can be a profitable business with wage inflation rising in India and the Philippines. So just to conclude, TaskUs will only scale as fast as they can hire cheap labor. They're heavily exposed to a single EMC. That's an acronym we used to use, Emerging Market Center. Their business segments don't seem very durable, as we explained. And of course, there's too much customer concentration risk. So interesting business on the tin. They had their IPO last year. Apparently, there was a lot of fanfare around it, enough for our subscribers to raise this as a company we should look at. But unfortunately, we don't see this as anything we would want to invest in. So please put your comments in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video today.